Yes, it gets better, David. So, David Jaber is the founder of Climate Positive Consulting, a firm that analyzes carbon footprint, crafts climate strategy, and drives greenhouse gas reduction. Over the last 20 years, David has worked with over 150 companies to help them advance environmental excellence. He is the author of the book Climate Positive Business: How You and Your Company Hit Bold Climate Goals and Go Net Zero. And we'll put the link to that in the chat. And he's also a Project Drawdown Fellow. In his free time, David enjoys restoring watersheds and holding politicians accountable. So we also want to hear more about that. So thanks for coming, David, and I'm going to tiptoe away.
Thanks so much, Dennis. And please tell Senator Becker he shouldn't take that last sentence personally. So to recap, my name is David Jaber. I am the founder of Climate Positive Consulting. So our company does three things. We analyze carbon footprints, we craft business climate strategy, we drive greenhouse gas reduction. And we work with companies usually in the US and Canada, kind of around these three things. And I am here primarily to talk about the phenomenon of ESG and how you work productively with it. So many of you have likely heard of ESG. So it stands for three material areas of business management: environments, social or society, and governance. And this is shown here as a range of issues within those three areas. So in the last three presentations, we heard about water, climate, and air pollution, all of which are included under environments. There's also biodiversity there as well. Under social, you have labor standards, health and safety, human rights, customer responsibility. And then there's a whole area of governance in terms of risk management, anti-corruption, the different sorts of policies that a business has to kind of ensure it's conducting itself in a proper way. So why we care about ESG is that it has exploded as a topic of conversation and a concern over the past 4 years, and particularly among investors. So those three areas are material to investors, among others, as areas of risk for companies. So your company might impact the environment, you might cause social disruption, or you might have a governance failure, and any of those things would affect the value of your company, thus the concern from investors. So those of you who've been following sustainability for a while may think this actually looks quite similar to triple bottom line or perhaps the GRI reporting framework, and you'd be right. In some ways, ESG represents catch-up that the financial community has done on sustainability, though with specificity again to the items that concern investors. These aspects of ESG occur throughout your supply chain, which may seem obvious, but it's worth stating. So if you represent a company, it's not just the impacts of your owned and operated facilities on biodiversity or health and safety or corporate governance that we care about, but it's your upstream suppliers as well as downstream, because that's still going to affect your reputation. And these are the positive and negative things that happen as a cost or benefit of doing business. I should say one thing I don't appreciate about this treatment is that it suggests there aren't interconnections between these areas. So the presentation is not as holistic as the reality. So climate affects biodiversity and water security affects human rights, community health and safety, and there's all kinds of other interconnections you could draw here. That said, it is helpful to have a framework that at least lifts up the topics that you need to look at within ESG. Within ESG, we also have different players, and the implications of ESG are different for each. So we have ESG raters and the ratings they produce. So these are companies like Moody's, MSCI, ISS, and probably at least a couple dozen others who are producing essentially bond ratings that imply what organizations are going to be good investments and whether your company comes with a relatively high or low ESG risk. Then we have the investors, who are those using the ESG ratings, among other means, to determine what investments are likely to give them good ESG returns. So companies that are going to provide some environmental benefit, social benefit, as well as financial benefit. And then we have the companies themselves that are seeking to prove that they're a good investment for ESG investors. And as an example of the amount of effort that this has driven, routinely now company boards of directors are forming ESG committees to determine how to best position themselves. And ESG is under fire. So ESG ratings and ESG as a field has been a subject of great critique for at least 12 months. And the issues are really on many levels. For one, ESG ratings measure risk. They do not necessarily measure your impacts on the surroundings and in these three areas. And that's may seem a little abstract, but so let me try to provide an example. One measure of risk could be the amount to which your CEO tweets, because said CEO could say something that hurts company reputation and company value. Elon Musk tweets more than the CEO of Exxon. So by that measure, Tesla would be a greater ESG risk than Exxon. Does that mean that Exxon's creating more benefits for the planet? That's unlikely. And so for those of us who would like ESG to represent actual performance, that's kind of a letdown, because you'd like to think these ratings actually are measuring sort of real world impact. Even if those ratings did measure impact, there's limited transparency on how the ratings are created. So you don't get to see everything behind the scenes that goes into an ESG rating. And if your company ended up with a D or an F, it would be nice to know why that's the case. There are regulators, definitely in the EU, and I know the SEC has a proposed rule out specifically on ESG that I think are working on greater transparency just to get better definitions, because it is kind of material to these investments and just how companies are perceived. There is also a third issue of trust. And this is sort of a different issue among the companies, but essentially it's a lack of trust that the investors want what they say they want. So if an investor was asking your company before for a 6% return, and now that they've achieved ESG enlightenment, they're asking you to create environmental and social benefits as well as provide a 6% return, it's hard to see how they're actually valuing the environmental and social capital. They're simply asking for the same return, but now asking for other benefits as well. And there's also kind of a flip side to that. For industries with serious environmental and social risks, are you as an investor committed to not invest in them, even if they offer a 10% return? Like you might think that it actually is valid for the investors to say, well, we do want return. We don't also want to make sure that you're not creating these environmental social problems. That certainly could be valid. But then there's the issue of, why are you not essentially valuing the environmental and social portions as much as you are the financial? Because there's all these different returns and capitals that are being created by companies' activities. So then what all of this adds up to is a limited ability of companies to prove ESG performance without clear standards that actually measure leadership. So Joel McCower is chairman of the sustainable media bastion GreenBiz Group. And over the last couple of months, he had a series of articles on ESG doing a deep dive, I think also because just seeing how significant the movement was. So this quote from one of his interviewees is striking. ESG has nothing to do with making the world a better place. And the person that is providing this quote is the head of ESG at a significant investment banking firm in the UK. If there's someone critiquing ESG, it shouldn't be this person. So quite possibly this will change and ESG actually will relate to making the world a better place. I certainly hope it does. But as it stands, this is a significant indictment. And so let's assume again, you represent a company and one that's seeking investment. You have pressures to prove to investors that you can support their ESG goals. You have ratings that may or may not reflect, what we consider ESG performance. And so the question to tackle in all this is, how do you prove you're worth ESG investment if so much of it isn't clear? So I can't offer the answer, but I can offer an answer. You might not have control over how a rating agency comes up with their ratings. What you can control are your strategies to take action in ESG related areas. And we have programs, protocols, and certifications that have been around for 5 and even 20 years, which you can use to show climate leadership, supply chain responsibility, and so much more. And so relevant to ESG, as we saw earlier, are impacts on climate. And since this is my area that I work in versus some of the other areas of ESG, I'm going to focus on that for the rest of the presentation. And so setting goals and targets to reduce those impacts that then become ESG relevant. So what a lot of people have already been doing our climate can translate to the ESG field. You're just now talking about them as reducing ESG risks versus reducing kind of greenhouse gas emissions. What lays the foundation for the discussion of goals and targets is greenhouse gas accounting and measurement. So you know what you have to reduce in the first place. So I don't have time to get into the details on accounting, as I want to focus on goals and targets. But let's presume you've gone through the process to measure the greenhouse gas emissions of your organization. Once you've done that, and you're looking at goals and targets, science-based targets is one key program to highlight. And I'll get into the details in that in a minute. Net zero targets are another, and one flavor of which is science-based targets, which they have their own version of net zero. And then there's also a range of reporting systems and certifications that relate to goals and targets that we can get into. So science-based targets. The best understanding of science indicates we need to make dramatic emission reductions. So whether you're a company or a country, setting targets any less ambitious than that does not make sense. And that idea, that logic has given us science-based targets, or SBTs as they're popularly known. At least the logic of SBTs is clear to over 3,000 businesses now that have committed to them, largely multinationals. It's an international movement for those of you that are not familiar. And as a platform, it's been around for barely 5 years, but it has grown tremendously in that time. Science-based targets also raises a certain philosophy on goals, and that revolves around the question of whether you set goals you know you can hit versus goals you need to hit, even if you don't completely know how to get there. SBTs are encouraging you to do the latter. So you set goals that reflect the interests of the planet and where we need to get to, and do some homework to make sure you can get some of the way there, but then also have some trust and faith that this is the path that you need to be on. And just so some additional details on science-based targets, their real genesis is in the Paris Agreement of 2015, where countries committed to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And expressing the target in that way is not particularly meaningful if for you as a business, you don't control global temperature, so you can't dial it down 1 or 2 degrees. What you can control are the greenhouse gas emissions that influence the temperature. And so science-based targets do that translation, and 1.5 degrees is equivalent to a 40% emission reduction in about 10 years. So you'll see a lot of science-based targets at a 2030 timeframe. People are using like 2020 baseline year. They have to be within 5 to 10 years past your baseline. That's one requirement. One critical factor in many business climate strategies that are not related to science-based targets is carbon offsets. And as many of you likely know, those are projects conducted outside of the boundaries of your organization to eliminate or remove greenhouse gases. So science-based targets do not allow for offsets to count toward your target. So that 40% goal that I just mentioned, that actually has to be reducing fossil fuel use, could be installing renewables, efficiency, looking at other ways to improve your procurement, and all of the suite of things and tools we have to reduce greenhouse gas footprint. And science-based targets is still evolving, as sort of that last line reflects, as it is. As a young program, they are still changing and refining, and also our understanding of the science and the reductions that need to be made also keep evolving, usually meeting more ambitious and not less. So that's science-based targets. From there, we move on to net zero. The United Nations helped launch corporate net zero goals through this Race to Zero program. One contrast with science-based targets is that net zero tends to look out further in time. So usually you'll hear companies talk about a 2050 timeframe, possibly 2040, but they're usually further out, certainly further out than 10 years. And the UN is asking not only businesses, but universities, cities, countries to achieve net zero by 2050 at the latest. Those that have committed or are participating in Race to Zero represent nearly 25% of global CO2 emissions and 50% of global GDP. So they have made real inroads and have a lot of commitments. And now, as with a lot of areas, we need to translate commitments into action. One criticism of net zero, at least until last year, was that the requirements weren't clear. So there was concern that companies might maintain or even increase their greenhouse gas emissions and then simply offset their footprint without making any emissions reductions. And I know I didn't define net zero earlier, but the general sense is that you're eliminating and reducing as many emissions as you put into the air that year. So if your company, through the mix of fossil fuels and other sources, is generating 10,000 tons, you need to bring that down over the next 10 to 30 years through a variety of efficiency, renewables, and eventually offsets. And the question here is, how much offsets is it appropriate to use? So last year, UN Race to Zero, as a response to this criticism where it wasn't clear if companies could just use offsets for everything, they issued credible net zero as a term, and they had a get net zero right document, which is basically asking for 50% reduction by 2030. And if you remember what I said about science-based targets, that's pretty well in line with what science-based targets asks for. And just to go over some of these last questions. So 50% reduction is that first question. Is there a clear plan to reduce? So it's not just the target, but making sure that you have clear actions. And is it fast enough in time to make that 2050 deadline? The last three of the six questions are just transparency and governance in terms of reporting what their emissions are now. So other entities, other stakeholders can check how well they're doing. Does their scope of commitment cover an adequate portion of their emissions, particularly scope 3, which is the emissions in their value chain beyond the boundaries of their organization? And then the sixth question, really narrowing on offsetting, really understanding what the role of offsetting is and just making sure that the other aspects of that are in place. Science-based targets has their own spin on that and came out with their version of net zero last September. The value of this to me is that science-based targets has more program structure than the UN. The UN is sort of encouraging people to adopt it, but they don't really have the infrastructure to kind of police goals and check things. Science-based targets, the stipulations have more weight. And science-based targets are currently, it's a voluntary program, it's not regulated, but the commitments are under scrutiny and they do have a validation process. And here's sort of the quick summary. So what I just talked to you about earlier about science-based targets was short-term. Net zero added this long-term layer where they're eventually asking for companies that are looking to claim net zero that you make a 90% reduction from your baseline emissions. And you have up to 2050 to do that. And then the other part of it is once you've done 90%, they'll allow 10% carbon removal, which you could think of as a special type of more permanent carbon offset. And they're saying, so basically of your baseline, there's 10% will allow you to offset long-term, but you still need to make 90% reductions. And that's, clearly a big ask of any company that has designed its systems around the availability of fossil fuel. But a lot of companies are really kind of tackling this and taking on, and there's genuine efforts to see how much progress, we can make in this decade. And just finally, as I'm getting close to closing up, so we just talked about science-based targets and Race to Zero. There are other certifications and programs out there that are also encouraging this level of reductions that you see as science-based targets. There's a corporation, a community of B corporations, 5,000 across the world, that have committed to embed social and environmental responsibility, kind of in the same way that ESG in theory is reaching for responsibility into operations. So they have a net zero by 2030, and they've also encouraged science-based targets among their partners. Climate Positive Consulting is one of the B Corps. Climate neutral is also a certification that you'll see fairly commonly among progressive companies on this front, where you have to go through a process to report to climate neutral your emissions, commit to offsetting, as well as have a plan for reduction. So they're encouraging science-based targets, although when you see the climate neutral label on a product, just know it doesn't mean they've made their science-based target yet. It just means that they've offset their existing footprint, and they have a commitment to bring it down over the next several years. And there's also the Sustainable Development Goals. Oh, actually, they don't really talk a lot about the business level about greenhouse gas emissions. There's national greenhouse gas emissions are an indicator, but the race to zero for companies are really more relevant, and that's who this presentation is really targeted toward. And with that, I think I'd just like to thank you for that quick fire overview of ESG and ways to embed responsibility even outside of clearer ESG definitions. But I think going back to these tried and true and established programs around climate, water, biodiversity, any number of aspects of ESG in society. On the society front, there's also fair trade standards. There's others. I think you can certainly use those to show ESG value, and hopefully we'll get to a place where the ratings and the investors are kind of better aligned on this real impact and real performance. But thank you.
Thank you, David. Yeah, that was. I'm just going to grab screen for a second, but that was a pretty fascinating. Rapid fire hose review of a lot of material. There is a question, and I know it crossed my mind too, that if what would be your take? I mean, a lot of the things we're talking about were, essentially, well, voluntary, agreements, and then there has been some stirrings at SEC, and so there is a question about the proposed SEC enhanced climate reporting proposals for companies, to really kind of hardwire that in 10K as far as what they see as risks. So how do you see that proposals for companies and asset managers playing out?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the SEC regulation. So there was a proposed rule on climate-related disclosures specifically. And I think I had mentioned an ESG disclosure, which it's more recent. I haven't looked into it, but there's a climate-related disclosures and comment closed last June, or just earlier this month. I think there will be value in that required disclosure. There are certainly a lot of companies that are already voluntarily disclosing. And my hope, and I think what SEC is poised to do, is actually leverage some of those voluntary standards, but just require every publicly traded or SEC regulated company to disclose emissions. There's certainly issues on, how well you define sort of scope 3, and scope 3 is actually challenging even for companies that are seriously looking at it. There's going to be a lot of questions there, but I think just the fact that they're asking companies to disclose that, which a lot of us would see as kind of a first key step into being able to reduce it, makes sense. And then you have other perspectives in there. I almost got into a fight on LinkedIn yesterday because someone was saying the SEC was garbage and you should just regulate everything. So require greenhouse gas emission reductions. I'm not seeing a lot of appetite at the federal level to do that currently, but it is sort of an interesting perspective. Like, we're far down this path of needing to take action. So if we already have a lot of voluntary disclosure, is required disclosure going to help us, or should we just say, no, we need to kind of lock down and actually regulate how much you're emitting?
Yeah, and actually, it's an interesting question about the regulation, and while we're talking about, say super scope 2 versus scope 3. And by the way, folks, scope 3 is, and David, you can fine tune this, but scope 3 is basically companies reaching out to their kind of supplier and distribution networks as far as their practices. I'm sure you have a better definition of that, but just wanted to kind of define what that mentioned.
I think you got it. The value chain beyond your own boundaries, both
Yeah,
upstream and downstream.
and you know that's certainly a. There may be actually. I'm something of a pessimist. We're talking about, this SEC thing. There actually might even be recent upcoming Supreme Court rulings basically questioning federal regulatory authorities, basis on governing and regulating, starting with EPA and possibly spilling over to SEC. So that might be something that be a major weather event that will come, but hopefully that won't come to pass. Although I keep seeing different people going to the Supreme Court's website, and refreshing to see what the latest news is.
Yeah. Well, and that would have been part of my comment to this group. It's, I see how regulations have, because we do need to make these reductions. And usually when you do that, you want to have a regulatory regime and actual requirements. But unless the Supreme Court and a super majority of the Senate are on board, I just not seeing that happen.
Yeah, and so there was another question kind of along those lines, like how can we penalize fossil fuel companies like big tobacco companies was eventually penalized like a Supreme Court case. And, I mean, in some ways you can answer that, well, the ground may shift, at least temporarily.
Yeah, and I think for years, I think there have been efforts, and a lot of people have seen promise in putting a price on carbon as sort of one mechanism to get that. In theory, fossil fuel company could just pass it on to customers, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But if you see all the outrage at $6 and $7 per gallon fuel right now, I don't think, at least a year ago, the taxes, wouldn't even have been anywhere near that high, but I think you'd still have, some level of rebellion against that. So I think there's ways that they would even pass on the price on carbon, but that's, if you're looking at disincentivizing fossil fuel use, that certainly could be one technique among others.
Yeah. Anyway, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. It's kind of a fascinating area that you dwell in, along, I guess, spilling over into LinkedIn. And thanks for coming, and stay out of fights.
I'll try. Thank you for having me. And I drop my email in the chat for anyone who wants to connect.